The shoe was dry. That's the part I still can't explain. The corridor had been leaking groundwater for weeks. The floor was slick. The walls were sweating. And right there in the middle of all that cold, wet concrete sat a single child's shoe. Bone dry. Placed upright, like someone had set it down carefully before walking off in two directions at once. I stood there for probably 10 seconds just staring at it. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much, but when you're alone in a flooded basement at 2 in the morning and your flashlight is the only light source for 100 feet in any direction, 10 seconds is a very long time to be that quiet. My name is Elena. I was 31 years old. I had been working nights at Mercy Cross Medical Center for almost 4 years, and I was not the kind of person who's scared easily. You don't last 4 years on the overnight facilities rotation if you are. You have to be the kind of person who can walk a decommissioned ward alone at 3 in the morning, hear something shift in the ceiling above you, and decide it's a pipe before your heart rate even registers the sound. I was that kind of person. I had built myself into her very deliberately, and I was proud of it. The shoe was a size 4, light blue. The Velcro strap was still clean. I remember the smell of that corridor. Old water, iron pipes, the faint chemical edge of the industrial cleaner they used on the main floors, 3 levels above me. All of it blending into something that tasted more than smelled, something that settled at the back of your throat and reminded you that this building was old in a way that had nothing to do with its last renovation. I had traced a fault in the emergency lighting grid down to this section, which meant I had a job to do and a checklist to finish before the 6 a.m. shift change. I crouched down and looked at the shoe without touching it. There were no small footprints in the wet floor. There was no trail of anything leading toward it or away from it. There was just the shoe and the water and the hum of the drainage pump somewhere deeper in the building. And me. I logged it as an unidentified object, took a photo, and kept moving. I was very good at keeping moving. What I did not log, and what I did not say out loud to anyone for a long time afterward, was that when I straightened up and turned back toward the junction cabinet I had come to inspect, I heard something from the floor above me. Through a foot of concrete and steel reinforcement, I heard it clearly enough that I stopped walking. It was a child, humming. Not distressed, not searching, just humming the way kids do when they are doing something with their hands and not paying attention to the rest of the world. Soft and wondering and completely, absolutely wrong. The floor above me was the old pediatric ward. It had been locked and decommissioned for over a year. I stood in that corridor for another long moment. Then I finished my checklist, filed my report, and went home. I told myself the sound was ventilation. Buildings this old have ductwork that runs everywhere, picks up vibration from traffic, from the floors above, from other wings. I had heard strange things in the ventilation before. This was the same. This was ordinary. I did not believe that, but I wrote it down in the part of my brain marked, "Things we are not going to look at right now." And I went to sleep, and for a few days I almost convinced myself it had worked. If any part of what I just described made the hair on your arm stand up, stick with me, because what happened over the next few months is something I have only told a handful of people in my life. Subscribe if you want the rest of it. I promise it gets harder to explain before it gets any easier. I took the overnight facilities job because the money was real, and the daytime version of my life was not working. I had spent most of my 20s doing construction inspection work, which paid fine and kept me outdoors. But then my mother got sick, and the hospital bills had a way of restructuring your priorities very fast. The overnight differential at Mercy Cross was significant enough that I ran the numbers twice to make sure I was reading them right. Nights, weekends, holidays, all of it. I said yes before they finished explaining the benefits package. The first thing you learn about working inside a hospital at night is that it has almost nothing in common with working inside a hospital during the day. During the day, it is loud and bright and chaotic in a way that has a kind of logic to it. The logic of systems under pressure, people moving fast because moving fast means someone, somewhere is being kept alive. At night, the pressure drops, and what's left is the building itself. The ventilation runs on reduced cycles. The lighting shifts to a lower tier. The corridors that felt institutional by day start to feel something else entirely. Not frightening exactly, but deliberate. Like the building has its own agenda once the visitors leave. I didn't mind it. I genuinely didn't. I had good instincts for infrastructure. I could read a fault log the way some people read a novel. And I found something satisfying in the idea that, while the city slept, I was moving through the bones of a place that kept people alive and making sure those bones held. It was quiet work and honest work, and it asked exactly the amount of me that I had left to give. I built routines the way I had always built routines, because routines are how you keep yourself grounded when the hours are strange and the environment is strange, and your body is slowly forgetting what sunlight feels like. Same route in the same order. Same coffee at the same time. Notebook in the left chest pocket, not the right, because the right sat against the wall when I crouched into service recesses, and I had cracked 2 screens that way before I learned the lesson. Details like that keep you sane. They give you something solid to stand on when everything else goes soft. And for a long time, that was all it was. Good, solid work in a quiet building. Checklist completed. Faults resolved. Nothing that didn't have an explanation. Then the lights in the east corridor started flickering, only when I walked under them. Not when my supervisor came through. Not when the overnight security guard did his rounds. Only me. And I started keeping a second notebook. The east corridor lights flickered for the first time on a Tuesday, and I know that because I had just finished the weekly panel inspection, and the timestamp on my last log entry was 11:47 at night. I walked back through that corridor toward the service elevator, and every third fixture buzzed and dipped as I passed under it, then came back to full brightness the moment I was 2 steps beyond it. Like something tracking me. Like a slow blink following me down the hall. I stopped walking. The lights stopped flickering. I started walking again. They started again, exactly in rhythm with my steps. I stood there in the middle of that corridor for a long moment and did the thing I always did when something didn't make sense. I wrote it down. Faulty ballast. Possible loose neutral on the circuit. Check junction box C14. I checked the junction box the next morning. Everything was tight, every connection clean. The lights flickered again that same night. Same card, same rhythm. Same feeling that something just behind my eyes was watching from inside the building's electrical system. I wrote it down again and used a different explanation this time. I was running out of explanations faster than I was comfortable admitting. The second notebook I started keeping was smaller than my work one, narrow enough to slide into my back pocket without a visible outline. I bought it from a pharmacy 2 blocks from the hospital, paid cash, and I want you to notice that detail because I noticed it at the time, and it told me something about where my head was already going. You don't pay cash for a notebook unless some part of you already knows you're recording something you might not want traced back to you. I wrote dates, times, locations, descriptions. I kept the language flat and factual, the way I kept my work logs, because flat and factual is how you stay credible to yourself when the content of what you're writing is starting to feel anything but. The lights, the shoe, the humming from the decommissioned ward, the way the temperature in the east wing dropped by what felt like 10 degrees every night between midnight and 1, and then climbed back without the HVAC cycling to explain it. That temperature thing I actually verified with a handheld thermometer I started carrying. I have the readings. They don't make sense on paper, and they made less sense standing in that corridor, watching the little number drop while the ventilation above me stayed completely silent. Cold air doesn't appear from nowhere in a sealed building. Physics doesn't allow for it. I wrote that down too, right next to the numbers, as if reminding myself of basic physics was going to be the thing that kept all of this in a category I could manage. What I have not told you yet, because I needed you to understand what kind of person I was before I tell you this, is what happened the night I finally went upstairs. It was a protocol violation. I knew that going in. The pediatric ward had been decommissioned after a flood damaged the subfloor, and access required a facilities supervisor to be present, documented, with a written reason. I had none of those things. What I had was 3 weeks of hearing something up there on nights when the building was otherwise completely silent, and a specific kind of stubbornness that has gotten me into trouble my entire life. I told myself I was going to confirm it was ventilation noise, write it up as a structural sound transfer issue, and be done with it. I told myself that very firmly in the elevator on the way up. The elevator opened onto the pediatric floor, and the smell hit me before the lights did. Not antiseptic, something older and softer, like the air in a room where flowers had been kept too long after the water went bad. Sweet in a way that set wrong in your chest. The corridor was dark except for the emergency strip lighting at floor level, that dim red glow that makes every hallway look like the inside of something alive. The doors to the patient rooms were all shut. I walked slowly, keeping my flashlight low, feeling the floor through my boots for soft spots, because the subfloor damage was real, even if my reason for being here wasn't strictly authorized. About halfway down the corridor, I stopped. The humming was there, clear and close, coming from the room at the far end, the one with the window that faced the back parking structure. I stood and listened and tried very hard to locate a mechanical source. An old speaker left on a low frequency, a resonating pipe, anything. But it had a breath pattern. It had the small, irregular rhythm of a child distracted by something in their hands, humming without knowing they were humming. I walked to the end of the corridor and put my hand on the door handle. The metal was ice cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature I had logged on the floor below. I opened the door. The room was empty. Stripped bed frame, bare mattress support, a single chair in the corner with a torn vinyl seat. The window was closed. The floor was dusty in a way that should have shown footprints if anything had been moving in here recently. There were no footprints. There was no source for the sound. And there was no sound anymore. The humming had stopped at the exact moment I turned the handle. What was there, in the dust on the windowsill, was a small handprint, 5 fingers clearly defined, at the height a child would reach if they were standing on their toes to look outside. The dust around it was completely undisturbed. The print was facing inward, which meant whoever made it had been standing on the outside of a window 4 floors above the ground. I went back to that windowsill 3 times over the next week, and each time I told myself a different story about what I had seen. First visit, I convinced myself it was an old print, something left before the ward was locked, preserved by the specific way dust settles in a sealed room. Second visit, I measured the window frame and confirmed it was a standard hospital casement, the kind that locks from inside with a lever mechanism, and the lever had been locked. Third visit, I brought a UV light I borrowed from the maintenance supply room without signing it out, and I checked the glass for any smearing, any transfer, any evidence of something pressed against the outside of the pane. The glass was clean. The print was only on the inside sill. I stood there in that empty room with my UV light and my flat factual thinking, and I understood for the first time that I was not going to be able to explain my way out of this. That feeling, that specific moment of your own logic running out of road, is something I would not wish on anyone. So I did what I always do when a problem stops being solvable by checking individual components. I pulled back and looked at the whole system. I spent 2 days going through every maintenance log, every incident report, every shift handover note filed in the last 3 years. I told my supervisor I was auditing the East Wing documentation for a structural assessment. He said, "Fine, good initiative," and went back to his office. I sat in the break room with a highlighter and a legal pad, and I started mapping everything that didn't fit. Minor power anomalies, temperature drops with no HVAC explanation, security motion alerts that logged and then cleared with no follow-up. One incident report from about 18 months before I started, where a night cleaner reported hearing a child in the pediatric corridor and refused to return to that floor. She had been reassigned without any formal investigation of her report. The line in the file that documented the reassignment said simply, "Staff comfort issue resolved." I stared at that line for a long time. Someone had decided that was a sufficient response. Someone had decided the correct solution was to move the person rather than examine what they saw. I kept going. What built up across those 2 days of reading was not a dramatic revelation. It was quieter than that and worse for it. The pattern was not one big event. It was dozens of small ones, spread across years, in the same areas of the building, during the same hours, involving different staff who had no contact with each other and no reason to be telling the same story. The East Corridor, the pediatric ward, and something I had not noticed before because I had never had reason to look at the building schematics in full detail, a section of sub-basement listed in the original construction records that did not appear on the current facility maps. Not mislabeled, not reclassified, just gone, as if someone had opened the document and deleted a wing. I found that absence on a Thursday evening at the end of my second day of digging, and I sat with it for a long time before I wrote it down. Because writing it down meant acknowledging that whatever was happening in this building was not random equipment behavior and not individual staff anxiety. It meant someone, at some point, had made a deliberate decision to erase a part of this place. And the question that followed that, the one I wrote in the small notebook and underlined once, was what exactly they had been trying to erase it from. Gerald found me in the break room the next morning before my shift ended. I want to tell you about Gerald properly, because he matters to what comes next more than I understood at the time. He was 62, maybe 63, the kind of man who had spent so long working inside large institutions that he had started to resemble one. Solid, unhurried, a face that didn't give much away unless you knew where to look. He had worked Mercy Cross for 14 years, longer than anyone else on the overnight team, and he had a reputation among the newer staff for being helpful in a very specific way. Not warm exactly, but precise. If you had a problem with a system you couldn't diagnose, Gerald could usually find the fault in under 10 minutes. He knew this building the way you know a face you've been looking at for years. Every asymmetry, every scar, every place where something healed wrong. He sat down across from me with 2 cups of coffee, slid one toward me without asking, and looked at the legal pad on the table in front of me. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just said, quietly, "You found the gap in the schematics." It wasn't a question. I looked at him and didn't say anything. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup the way people do when they're about to say something they've been carrying for a while, and he said, "I've been waiting for someone methodical enough to get there on their own." Then he reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and pulled out a battered journal with a rubber band holding it shut, and he set it on the table between us without opening it. He said, "Read this before you go down there." I said, "Go down where?" He said, "You already know where." And then he finished his coffee and left the break room, and I sat there alone with his journal and the sound of the building's ventilation doing its slow pre-dawn exhale around me. And I did not reach for the journal for a very long time, because he was right. I already knew exactly where. Gerald's journal had 14 years of entries, and the last page that wasn't blank ended mid-sentence. Not at the bottom of a page where you might run out of space and continue elsewhere. Mid-sentence, mid-word, the pen line trailing off to the right, like his hand had kept moving after his thoughts stopped. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, and I sat with it for a moment before I turned back to the beginning and started reading properly. He wrote the way he talked, flat, precise, no extra words. Dates, times, locations, observations. The first few years read almost identically to my own small notebook. The same East Corridor anomalies, the same temperature drops, the same motion alerts that cleared themselves. What was different was the accumulation. 14 years of the same patterns, documented by a man who had clearly decided very early on that he was going to keep recording whether or not anyone ever read it. There's something quietly devastating about that kind of commitment. He wasn't writing for anyone. He was writing because the alternative was pretending none of it was happening. And Gerald was not built for pretending. About a third of the way through, the entries changed. He had found the gap in the schematics the same way I had, by pulling original construction records and comparing them to the current facility maps. He had done it years before me. He had also found something I hadn't gotten to yet, a reference in an old Facilities Committee memo to a formal review of the sub-basement section, following what the memo called an environmental incident during a period of extreme heat. The memo recommended the section be sealed pending remediation. There was no follow-up memo, no remediation report. No record of the section ever being officially reopened or permanently closed. It had simply been removed from the active documentation and left in a state the institution had decided, collectively and silently, never to revisit. Gerald had gone down there. He documented it across several entries written close together, which told me he had gone multiple times over a short period. His descriptions were careful and detailed, and completely without the kind of language that would have made them easier to dismiss. He didn't write that the place felt wrong, or that he sensed something. He wrote what he saw, and measured, and timed. Bed still made, charts still hanging, a logbook open to a specific page. He wrote the temperature of the air, several degrees below the surrounding corridors, sustained and consistent, regardless of the time of night or the external weather. He wrote about the quality of the light from his torch in that space, how it seemed to travel differently, as if the air itself had more resistance than it should. And then, about 2/3 through the journal, he wrote something that made me set the whole thing down on the break room table and look at the wall for a moment. He wrote, "I think some of them are aware of me now. I think one of them has started moving toward the entrance before I arrive, as if it knows when I'm coming. I don't know what that means yet. I'm going to find out." The entries after that were shorter, more clipped, like he was writing faster, or like the act of putting things into words had started to feel less useful than it had before. And then the trailing pen line, mid-word, nothing after. I read the whole thing twice. Then I put it in my bag, finished my shift, and drove home in the early morning light with the specific kind of tiredness that isn't about sleep. I sat in my car in my building's parking structure for 20 minutes before I went inside. I kept thinking about the memo's phrase, environmental incident during a period of extreme heat, and what that language was built to contain and what it was built to hide. Institutions learn to speak in ways that make the worst things sound administrative. I had filed enough reports to know that. But sitting with Gerald's journal in my bag, I understood for the first time that the building I had been working in for 4 years had its own version of that language, its own way of keeping certain things from becoming official, and that the people who built those systems of containment had probably believed they were doing the right thing. That almost made it worse. The sub-basement entrance was behind a utility door on the lowest accessible level, marked on the current schematics as a drainage access point. The lock was a standard facility key, which I had. I had always had it. I had walked past that door probably 200 times. I stood in front of it on the following night with my flashlight, my small notebook, a thermometer, and Gerald's journal in my bag. And I thought about the plan I had made for myself, which was to observe only, document only, not engage with anything I couldn't explain. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that assumes the thing you're walking into will respect boundaries you set in advance. I unlocked the door. The air that came through was cold enough that I felt it on my face before I felt it on my hands. And it carried that smell again, the one from the pediatric ward. Old flowers in warm water, but denser here, and underneath it something else, something mineral and old, like stone that had been wet for a very long time. The corridor beyond the door was narrow. The ceiling was lower than the standard building specification, low enough that I instinctively kept my head slightly down, even though I had clearance. Emergency strip lighting ran along the baseboards, still functional, casting that same dim red glow that made everything look like the inside of something that was still alive. I moved slowly, one hand on the wall, feeling the texture of the plaster change under my fingers as I went deeper. It became rougher, older, less finished, like the corridor had been built in stages by people who stopped caring about the surface as they went further in. The beds appeared on my left first, through an open doorway, and I stopped. They were made, not slept in and abandoned. Made. Tight corners, flat pillows, the kind of deliberate neatness that takes time and intention. In a sealed section of a building no one had officially entered in years. I stood in that doorway and held my flashlight steady and said nothing and breathed very carefully. And from somewhere further down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the open chart holders, past all of it, came a sound I recognized immediately. Not humming this time. Breathing. Slow and regular, and completely, absolutely calm. As if whatever was down there had been waiting long enough that waiting no longer required any effort at all. I followed the breathing, and I want to be very clear that I knew exactly how irrational that was. I knew it the way you know something is hot before you touch it, a complete and certain knowledge that does nothing at all to stop your hand from moving. I walked past the nurse's station with my flashlight held low and my thermometer reading dropping with every step, past the open chart holders with their empty plastic sleeves, past a wall phone with the receiver slightly off the hook, the cord swaying almost imperceptibly in air that should have been completely still. The breathing was coming from behind a door at the far end of the corridor, the last room on the left, and what I noticed as I got closer was that the door was not fully shut. There was a gap of maybe 2 inches, and through it came that sound, steady and slow, and a thin line of light that was warmer in color than my flashlight, and warmer in color than the red emergency strips. Something in there was producing its own light. I pushed the door open with my fingertips, and it swung inward without resistance, and the breathing stopped the exact moment the door was fully open. Not faded, not slowed, stopped, like a recording cut off mid-track. The room was large, larger than the individual patient rooms I had passed, more like a shared ward, with space for 8 beds arranged in 2 rows, all made, all empty, all with that same tight, deliberate neatness that had stopped me cold at the first doorway. At the far end of the room, mounted on the wall, was a large mirror in a plain metal frame, the kind hospitals use in communal areas, full height, slightly tilted forward at the top. And in that mirror, I saw myself standing in the doorway, flashlight in hand, thermometer clipped to my collar, bag over one shoulder. Everything correct, everything exactly as it should have been, except my reflection was standing still, and I had just taken a step forward. I stopped moving entirely. My reflection caught up after a pause I could feel more than measure. Maybe half a second, maybe less, but enough. Enough to be certain. I raised my right hand slowly. My reflection raised its left hand slowly. Not a mirror image, the same hand, and not at the same time. I lowered my hand. My reflection held its position for a moment that stretched in a way that had no business stretching, and then lowered its hand, too. I stood in that doorway, and my chest was doing something I had never felt before. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling of standing at a very high edge and understanding for the first time in a physical way that gravity is not your friend. I stepped back into the corridor. My reflection stepped back too, after that same terrible delay. I turned around and walked back the way I had come, not running, because something in me understood that running would change whatever was currently happening into something worse. I kept my steps even. I kept my breathing even. I unlocked the utility door, stepped back into the main building, and locked it behind me. I stood with my back against that door for a full minute before I moved. I filed no report. I went home and sat at my kitchen table with Gerald's journal open in front of me and found the entry I'd remembered while walking back through that corridor. He had been in the same room. He had not mentioned the mirror. He had written instead about the quality of the silence in there, how it felt less like an absence of sound and more like sound being actively held back, as if the room was full of breath being carefully contained. Reading that in my kitchen, I understood we had both been in the same place and experienced it differently, and that the difference said something about what the room chose to show each person who entered it. That thought did not make me feel better. I took 3 days away from the building, told my supervisor I had a family matter to handle, which was not entirely untrue because my mother's health had been unsteady, and I had been using that as an excuse for years whenever I needed to step back from something. On the second day, I drove past the hospital without stopping and sat in a coffee shop across the street and looked at the building from the outside for about an hour. It looked entirely ordinary. Red brick, institutional windows, ambulance bay on the east side, staff parking beyond the security barrier. Nothing about its exterior suggested what was in its basement. Nothing ever does. On the third day, I went back to my records and found the thing I had been putting off looking at directly. In Gerald's journal, cross-referenced against my own small notebook, there was a detail that connected everything in a way I had been circling without landing on. Every anomaly I had documented, the lights, the temperature drops, the sounds, the motion alerts, clustered around specific times of night. And those times corresponded, almost exactly, to the shift changes that would have been in effect in the sub-basement ward during the period before it was sealed. Whatever was happening in that wing was not random. It was running on a schedule, the schedule of a ward that had not officially operated in years. And it was running that schedule every single night, with the kind of consistency that only comes from something that has been doing the same thing for so long that doing it has become indistinguishable from simply existing. I wrote that down and looked at it for a long time. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I went back to the sub-basement. Not at night this time. In the gray early morning before my shift started, when the building was in that transitional state between night quiet and day noise. I unlocked the utility door. I walked the corridor again. I went back to that large room at the end. The mirror was still there. My reflection moved with me this time, correctly and immediately, and I almost laughed with relief. Then I noticed the logbook on the nurse's station I had passed without stopping before. It was open. I had not touched it on my first visit. I had not opened it. But it was open now, to a specific page. And the last entry on that page was written in a hand that was not Gerald's and not mine. And it was dated from the week the ward was sealed. And it ended mid-sentence. And the sentence it had been midway through when it stopped was this: "They will not leave because no one has told them they are allowed to. They will not leave because no one has told them they are allowed to." I read that sentence 4 times standing at that nurse's station, and each time it landed differently. The first time it felt like a description. The second time it felt like an explanation. The third time it felt like an instruction. By the 4th time, I understood that whoever wrote it had known exactly what they were leaving behind and had left it there on purpose, in a place they believed someone would eventually find. Someone methodical enough. Someone who kept records. Someone who would follow the pattern all the way to the end instead of reassigning themselves to a different floor and writing "staff comfort issue resolved" in a file no one would read again. I photographed the page with my phone. Then I stood back and looked at the logbook as a whole, at its position on the station counter, at the way it was angled slightly toward the corridor entrance, toward the direction anyone approaching from the main building would come from. It had not been placed carelessly. It had been placed for someone arriving. I thought about Gerald's final journal entries, shorter, faster, that trailing pen line. I thought about what he had written, that one of them had started moving toward the entrance before he arrived, as if it knew when he was coming. And I thought about the fact that Gerald had stopped coming. Whatever had been moving toward the entrance to meet him was still moving there, still timing itself to an arrival that kept not happening. I went upstairs and started my shift, and functioned normally for 8 hours, and filed 3 routine maintenance reports, and replaced a faulty pressure sensor in the east corridor, and ate lunch in the break room, and did not say anything to anyone about what I had found in the basement. I was very good at that by then. Compartmentalization is a skill like any other. You practice it enough and it stops feeling like suppression and starts feeling like efficiency. The only sign that anything was different was that I drank 4 cups of coffee instead of my usual 2, and by the time my shift ended, my hands were steadier than they had any right to be. That night at home, I pulled up everything I could find through public records about Mercy Cross during the period referenced in the facilities memo. News archives, local planning documents, health authority reports. What I found was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. There was a brief mention in a regional health bulletin of a review of patient care protocols at the facility following an unusually high number of transfers that had not been completed during a period of extreme summer heat. The language was careful and institutional and deeply practiced at saying nothing while appearing to say something. No names, no numbers, no specifics about which ward or which patients or what not completed actually meant in human terms. Just a note that protocols had been reviewed and updated and that the relevant section of the facility had been modernized. Modernized. That was the word they used. I wrote it down in my small notebook with a circle around it, because I had seen that section, and modernized was not the word I would have chosen. I would have chosen sealed. I would have chosen abandoned. I would have chosen left exactly as it was on the last day anyone official set foot in it. Beds made, charts empty, logbook open, the whole thing running on the ghost of a schedule like a clock someone forgot to stop. The next night I went back down. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy to frame it as courage or as professional obligation, or as the kind of recklessness that makes for a good story. The real reason was simpler and harder to admit. That sentence in the logbook had gotten into me in a way I could not get it out of. They will not leave because no one has told them they are allowed to. I kept thinking about what that meant as a practical statement, as something requiring a practical response. I had spent 4 years keeping systems running by identifying what was wrong and doing the thing that fixed it. And somewhere in the part of my brain that had been built by 4 years of night shifts and maintenance logs and routines constructed to keep me functional in an environment that asked a lot, something had quietly decided that this was also a system. And systems have solutions. Even the ones that have no business being solved by someone with a flashlight and a field notebook. I went down at the same time as before, that gray transitional hour before the building fully committed to daytime. The corridor felt different in a way I noticed before I could name it. Less dense, like the air had more room in it than it had on my previous visits. The smell was still there, but lighter, less concentrated. I walked to the large ward room at the end and stood in the doorway. The mirror was there. My reflection was correct and immediate. The beds were made. The room was still. And it was empty in a way that felt different from before. Not the emptiness of a space holding something back, but the emptiness of a space that had recently been full and was now simply vacant. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked in and sat in the chair nearest the door, the one with the clearest view of the whole room, and I waited. I did not know what I was waiting for. I knew I was in the right place to wait for it. At the exact time the anomalies had always peaked, that specific window I had charted across months of data, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, immediately, like a door opening onto winter. My breath became visible. The red emergency strips along the baseboard brightened slightly. Not enough to call it light, enough to call it attention. And around me, in the chairs arranged in their loose circle in the center of the room, I became aware of presences the way you become aware of someone standing behind you, not by seeing them, not by hearing them, but by the change in the room's relationship with itself. The air had weight where it had not had weight before. The silence had texture. And from every direction at once, very softly, came the sound of breathing. Many people, all at rest, all waiting, and all I understood with complete and total clarity oriented toward me. I said, "I see you." Out loud. In a sealed basement room, with my breath fogging in front of my face, and presences arranged in a circle around me that I could feel but not see. I want you to understand that I did not plan to say it. It was not a brave decision. It came out of me the way things come out when your conscious mind steps aside and something older and more instinctive takes the wheel. The words were just there, in the air, before I had finished deciding to speak them. I see you. 3 words, and the room changed, not dramatically, not with a sound or a rush of wind or anything that would make sense as a cinematic response. The change was quieter than that and more complete. The weight in the air shifted. The breathing around me, which had been that sustained collective stillness of people waiting for something they had stopped expecting, changed in rhythm, became slightly less held, like the first adjustment a room full of people makes when someone finally opens a window. The temperature was still cold. The red strip lighting was still dim. Nothing about the physical space altered, but something in the relationship between me and that room changed fundamentally in the seconds after I spoke, and I felt it in my chest before I understood it in my head. Whatever had been waiting in there had been waiting to be acknowledged, and I had just done it. Without a protocol, without a form, without any of the systems and structures I had spent my entire career building between myself and the things I could not explain. I sat in that chair for a long time after that. I don't know exactly how long because I had stopped checking my watch, which is something I never do. And when I finally looked at it, the shift change was less than an hour away. What I can tell you is that nothing in that room harmed me. Nothing moved toward me in a way that felt threatening. What happened instead was a gradual settling, like barometric pressure finding its level after a front passes through. The breathing slowed. The cold air thinned. By the time I stood up and picked up my bag and walked back to the door, the room felt different in the same way the ward corridor had felt different on that last visit. Lighter, less dense, as if something that had been compressed for a very long time was beginning very slowly to decompress. I walked back through the corridor and up through the utility door and into the main building, and I stood in the service corridor on the lowest main level, and I leaned against the wall, and I did not move for several minutes. I was not distressed, I was not relieved. I was something I do not have a precise word for. Present, maybe. More present than I had felt in years. I finished my shift. I filed my reports. I ate something from the vending machine in the break room and drank 1 cup of coffee and watched the day shift arrive with the particular clarity that comes when you have been awake for a long time and your brain has stopped filtering the world and started receiving it directly. I told no one what had happened in the basement. What would I have said? That I sat in a chair in a decommissioned ward and spoke 3 words into cold air, and something in the building's relationship with itself shifted? That I had spent months documenting anomalies with a second notebook I paid cash for, and the conclusion I had reached was not a mechanical fault, but something older and more patient than anything on my maintenance checklist. I went home and slept for 10 hours and woke up feeling like I had put down something I had been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. The anomalies changed after that, not immediately and not completely, but in ways that were measurable and consistent, which meant they were real and not something I was projecting onto ordinary data. The east corridor lights stopped flickering. The temperature drops in the sub-basement became shallower and shorter, still present, but diminishing across the following weeks, the way an echo diminishes when the original sound has stopped. The motion alerts in the eastern section went quiet. I tracked all of it in a small notebook the same way I had tracked the original pattern. Same flat, factual language, same timestamps, because the record needed to be complete in both directions. Whatever had been running on that old ward schedule was running it less urgently, less often. The precision of it, the thing that had made it feel less like haunting and more like a system stuck in a loop, that precision was loosening. I found Gerald's journal on the stairwell landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors on a morning about 2 weeks after the basement room. It was sitting on the middle step, rubber bands still in place, completely dry in a stairwell where condensation collected on the handrails every night. I had no explanation for how it got there. I had taken it home with me after that break room morning when he had slid it across the table. It had been in my bag, then on my kitchen table, then in the drawer where I kept the things I was not done thinking about. It should not have been in that stairwell. I picked it up and took it to the break room and sat down with it and opened it to the last written page, the one with the trailing pen line and the mid-word stop. And below that line, in handwriting that was not Gerald's and not mine, in ink that looks dry and old, even though it had not been there the last time I looked at this page, were 4 words. It is better now. It is better now. 4 words in handwriting that belonged to no one currently alive in that building, in a journal that had been in my kitchen drawer, in a stairwell it had no physical way of reaching. I sat in the break room with that page open in front of me, and I did not try to explain it. That was new for me. The part of my brain that had spent months building alternative theories, ventilation noise, equipment faults, visual distortion from fatigue. That part had gone quiet. Not because I had given up on reason, because reason had done its job. It had followed the evidence all the way to the end, and the end did not fit any category I had been trained to use. And sometimes the honest thing is to stop insisting on a category and just look at what is actually in front of you. What was in front of me was a message from something that had needed a very long time and a very specific kind of person to finally receive it. I closed the journal. I put it back in my bag, and I sat there finishing my coffee while the day shift arrived around me in their ordinary morning noise, and I thought about Gerald, where he was, whether he had left because the building had started to feel like too much, or because it had started to feel like not enough. Whether his final entry, that mid-word trailing line, had been interrupted by something in the room with him, or whether he had simply run out of the particular courage it takes to keep writing things down when the things you are writing have stopped making sense in any language you know. I hoped he was somewhere ordinary. I hoped he had a window with good light and a coffee that was still hot, and nothing in his walls that breathed. I tried his number that afternoon from my car in the hospital parking structure. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was normal, which was what it had always done. But this time his voicemail greeting was different. The recorded message was gone. In its place was silence, about 3 seconds of it, and then a sound I recognized before I had time to brace for it. The building's ventilation. The specific frequency and rhythm of the HVAC system in the lower east corridor, the one I had listened to so many times that I could have identified it anywhere. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then the tone, then silence. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. Then I put it face down in the passenger seat, and I drove home, and I did not call again. I want to be careful about what I say here and what conclusions I draw from it, because Gerald was a real person, and I am not going to tell you I know what happened to him. What I know is that he had been going into that basement for years, alone, documenting things that had no official category, and that at some point the entries got shorter and the handwriting got less careful, and then they stopped. And I know that the building, or whatever moves through the building, had been aware of him in a way it eventually became aware of me. The difference between us, as far as I can work out, is that Gerald kept going back to observe, and I eventually went back to respond. I don't know if that distinction mattered. I think it might have. I think there is a significant difference between witnessing something and acknowledging it, and I think that difference has consequences that neither of us could have found in any maintenance manual. The weeks after the journal on the stairwell landing were the strangest of my time at Mercy Cross. Not because things became more frightening, but because they became less so in a way that required constant adjustment. I had built my entire relationship with that building around managing what was wrong with it. When the wrongness started to recede, I did not know what to do with my hands. I kept doing my rounds. I kept filing my reports. The east corridor lights stayed steady. The temperature in the sub-basement normalized enough that my readings were within standard variance. I went down one more time 2 weeks after the journal reappeared, and the large ward room at the end of the corridor was simply a room. Cold, quiet, smelling of old plaster and time. The bed still made, the mirror correct and immediate. The chairs still in their circle in the center, but the circle felt empty in the ordinary way of empty rooms, not in the weighted, pressurized way it had felt before. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes. I said quietly into the room, "I hope that helped." Then I went back upstairs. But here is the thing about settling, and this is the part I did not expect. When the building stopped pressing against me from the outside, I started noticing what it had left inside. Small things at first. I would be in the middle of a routine inspection, and a particular quality of silence would settle around me that reminded me exactly of that room on that morning. And for a second, I would feel that same strange present tense feeling, that clarity I had not had a word for. My hand stayed steady in situations that would previously have spiked my focus into something tighter and less comfortable. I slept better. Not because the fear was gone, but because I had stopped carrying the gap between what I knew and what I had seen. That gap had closed, and the energy that closing took turned out to be substantial. And then one afternoon, about a month after everything had quieted, I walked into the supply room on the third floor to restock my kit and found my supervisor standing at the shelf with an expression I had never seen on him before. He was holding a clipboard but not looking at it. He was looking at the corner of the room above the window. I followed his gaze. Nothing was there. I asked if he was okay. He blinked, looked at me, and said he had heard something. I asked what kind of something. He said it was probably nothing, a kid, maybe from outside. The ventilation picked up all kinds of things in this building. He was sure it was nothing. He said it the way I used to say things, with the flat tone of someone building a wall around an experience they have decided not to examine. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said very quietly, "If it keeps happening, come find me." He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts confused and relieved, like I had said something in a language he had not expected anyone here to speak. He nodded once. Then he went back to his clipboard. I restocked my kit and left the room, and on my way down the corridor I thought, with a clarity that felt like ice water, that the building was not done. It had shifted, yes. Something in its lowest section had changed, but the building was large and old, and it had been accumulating its particular kind of history for a very long time. And one conversation in one basement room was not a solution to all of that. It was a beginning. And beginnings, in my experience, have a way of requiring more from you than you budgeted for. My badge stopped working on every floor except the basement 6 weeks after my supervisor heard the humming in the supply room. Not all at once. One floor at a time, over the course of about 10 days, as if the building were methodically rerouting its relationship with me, clarifying which parts of it still considered me a relevant presence and which parts had moved on. I reported it to Facilities Administration as a card fault. They issued me a replacement. The replacement worked for 2 days and then began doing the same thing. I reported it again. They issued another. By the third replacement, I had stopped reporting it. I understood what was happening was not a card fault in any sense that administration could fix. And I was tired of generating paperwork that pointed toward a conclusion no one in that office was equipped to receive. What I did instead was what I had always done when a system stopped responding normally. I paid attention to what it was actually telling me. The badge worked in the basement. The badge worked in the service corridors on the lowest level. The badge worked at the sub-basement utility door, which I had been down to twice more since the morning I sat in the wardroom chair, each time finding the space quieter than the last, each time standing in the doorway of the large room and saying nothing, just being present, just letting the room register that I was there and that I was not going to pretend otherwise. The badge worked everywhere the building had been most honest with me. It did not work where the building ran its official face. I thought about what that meant for a long time before I admitted that I already knew. I started arriving for shifts and going directly down before clocking in. Not to document, not to investigate, just to stand in that corridor for a few minutes, in the way you might stop by a place that was important to you before doing anything else with your day. I don't know exactly when that became a routine. I know that the building felt different on the nights I did it versus the nights I went straight to my rounds. Less like a structure I was responsible for maintaining, and more like a place I was in a relationship with. That distinction felt significant and slightly unnerving, and completely true. One morning I found a single dry flower on the floor outside the utility door. A small, pale thing, the kind that grows in disturbed ground, No roots, no stem, just the flower head placed flat on the concrete as if set down deliberately. I picked it up and held it for a moment and thought about the old sweet smell from the pediatric ward, how it had been fading steadily over the past weeks. Then I put the flower in my chest pocket and went upstairs and started my shift. I still have it. It is pressed between 2 pages of my small notebook, the last entry on the left and the first blank page on the right. I gave my notice 3 weeks after that. My supervisor accepted it with the polite disappointment of someone who had come to rely on a person without fully registering that they were doing so. He asked if it was the hours. I said yes, partly. He asked if it was the pay. I said no. He did not ask what the other part was, which was the right instinct. I cleaned out my locker on a Wednesday morning, the building quiet around me in that way it was always quiet at the shift change, that particular held breath between one set of hands leaving and another arriving. I took Gerald's journal. I took both my notebooks. I took a spare key I had never returned, not for any specific reason, just because returning it would have required an explanation, and I was done with explanations that did not fit the forms they were supposed to fill. I walked out through the main entrance for the last time and stood on the pavement outside and looked up at the building's face. Red brick, institutional windows, nothing about its exterior suggesting anything other than what it officially was. But I had been inside it long enough to know that exteriors are the least honest thing about any structure. The honest parts are the ones people stop looking at. The basement sections that get removed from maps. The wards that get sealed and administratively erased. The log books left open on nurses' stations and corridors no one maintains. Those are the load-bearing parts in a different kind of architecture. The one that holds not walls and floors, but everything a place has been asked to contain without acknowledgement. I looked up at the pediatric ward windows on the 4th floor. I do not know what I expected to see. I saw nothing except the gray morning sky reflected in the glass. I nodded once at the building, which I am aware sounds strange and which I am telling you anyway because it is what happened, and this whole account has been about telling you what happened rather than what sounds reasonable. Then I walked to my car and drove away and did not look in the rearview mirror. I work daytime hours now in a different kind of facility, newer, smaller, one that has not had long enough to accumulate the particular kind of history that Mercy Cross had been carrying for decades. I keep notebooks still, old habit. The small one from those years is in my desk drawer at home, full to the last page, the pressed flower marking the end of it. I do not read it often. When I do, it still feels accurate in a way that is hard to describe. Not frightening anymore, just true, the way a scar feels true. A specific record of a specific event, written into the body of the thing that survived it. The humming comes back occasionally, not in hospitals or large buildings, but in ordinary places. A stairwell in an office block, the corridor of a parking structure late in the evening, a quiet wing of a library after closing. Brief, soft, with that same wandering quality of someone distracted by something in their hands. When it happens, I stop and I listen until it finishes, and I do not try to locate its source. I have learned that some things do not need to be located. They need to be heard. There is a difference, and understanding that difference is probably the most useful thing those 4 years gave me. Not the anomaly logs, not the cross-referenced data, not even Gerald's journal with its 14 years of flat, careful documentation. Just that. The difference between hunting for something and being still enough to let it reach you. The building is still there. I have driven past it twice in the year since I left. It looks the same from the outside. I assume it is different on the inside, at least in certain parts of it. At least in the hours between midnight and the shift change, when the ventilation runs on its reduced cycle and the corridors find their own rhythm. I hope the east wing lights stay steady. I hope the temperature in the sub-basement holds. I hope that whoever works nights there now has good instincts and a tolerance for things that do not fit the form, and the specific kind of courage it takes to stay present when presence is the only thing being asked of you. I hope they keep good notebooks. And if they ever find a logbook open to a page they did not open, I hope they read it slowly. Because the things that write in those margins have usually been waiting a very long time for someone to look. Here is what I actually learned. Not the lesson I expected going in. Not something about the paranormal or the limits of rational thinking or whether certain things survive in certain places. The lesson was simpler and harder to sit with. Every system, whether it is a building or a relationship or a life, accumulates what it is not allowed to process. It stores it. It runs it on a loop in the parts of itself no one maintains. And it will keep running that loop indefinitely with perfect, exhausting consistency until someone comes along who is willing to stop and acknowledge what is actually there rather than what the official record says should be there. I was not a specialist. I had no training for what I found in that basement. What I had was the willingness to stay in the room, and it turned out that was the only qualification required. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to think about it honestly. Is there something in your life right now that has been running on a loop? Something you have been documenting from a safe distance, observing but not engaging, building alternative explanations for, because the real one feels like too much to write down. Something that keeps showing up in the same corridor at the same hour no matter how many times you file it under equipment fault and move on. Because in my experience, those things do not stop. They just get quieter in the way that makes you think they are gone. They are not gone. They are waiting. And the only thing that actually changes anything is the same 3 words I said in a cold room, in a sealed basement, that no one was supposed to know existed. I see you. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me about your own corridor, the one you keep walking past without stopping. And if you want more accounts like this one, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps, and I have more to tell.